When I found the forged quitclaim deed to my late mother's lakeside cabin sitting casually on the kitchen island, my father was in the other room booking first-class tickets to San Torini for my sister's month-long birthday getaway. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I quietly took a high-resolution photo of the document, slid it back onto the stack of mail, and walked out the front door to call my attorney. 72 hours later, their entire financial world collapsed, and they never saw it coming. You always think you know your family. You believe, despite all the historical evidence staring you in the face, that there is a floor to their behavior, a line they simply will not cross. For 28 years, I was the designated shock absorber for my family's dysfunction. My name is Alina, and if you are the scapegoat of your family, you already know the exact texture of the exhaustion I woke up with every single day. My sister, Chloe, was the golden child. It wasn't just a label. It was an institution. It was a religion my father practiced with a terrifying, unyielding devotion. If Chloe wanted to try horseback riding at age 10, my college fund was quietly rated to buy a purebred mare that she rode exactly 3 times before deciding the stable smelled weird. If Chloe failed a semester of college because she was too hungover to attend finals, my father blamed the professors for lacking empathy and paid for a private tutor. I, on the other hand, was expected to be perpetually grateful for the oxygen I consumed. My achievements were baseline expectations. Her failures were tragic circumstances inflicted upon her by an unfair world. When my mother was alive, she tried desperately to balance the scales. But she was exhausted too. My parents divorced when I was 12. While my father took Chloe and molded her into a walking monument to his own ego, I stayed with my mom. We lived quietly in a modest apartment in the city, but her true sanctuary was a small, beautifully weathered cabin on Lake George. It had belonged to her parents and then to her. It wasn't a mansion by any stretch. It had drafty windows, a roof that leaked during heavy storms, and a porch that creaked like the hull of an old ship, but it was ours. It smelled of pine needles, old paperbacks, and safety. It was the only place in the world where I felt entirely unseen by my father's judgment, entirely unburdened by my sister's manufactured crises. 3 years ago, my mother passed away from a sudden, aggressive illness. It gutted me. In her will, she left the cabin exclusively to me, not to my father, who had surrendered all claims to her family assets in the bitter divorce, and certainly not to Chloe, who had once called the cabin a mosquito-infested depression trap and refused to visit it for over a decade. The cabin was mine. It was legally, clearly, and indisputably transferred to my name, with all taxes paid up and the deed resting securely in a safety deposit box. At least, that is what the county record stated. But in my father's mind, what was mine was actually just holding space for whatever Chloe might need in the future. The gaslighting started almost immediately after the funeral. My father would make passing comments at family dinners I only attended because I had swallowed the toxic lie that maintaining a relationship with my remaining blood relative was my moral obligation. You know, Alina, he would say, swirling his scotch and refusing to make eye contact, that cabin is just sitting there rotting. Chloe is looking to buy a condo downtown. It seems incredibly selfish of you to hoard a second property you barely use when your sister is trying to build her life. I would explain, patiently and defensively, that I spent every other weekend at the cabin, that I was restoring the roof, that it was my only tangible connection to my mother, that it wasn't just a financial asset to be liquidated for cash, it was a home. He would just sigh, looking at me with that signature mixture of pity and thinly veiled disgust. You always were so rigid, Alina, so unwilling to look at the bigger picture. We are a family and family helps each other. For 3 years I absorbed it. I smiled tightly. I deflected his barbs. I paid for my own meals, never asked them for a dime, and subjected myself to their constant belittling just to avoid the explosive fallout of walking away. I kept the peace. I look back at that version of myself now, and I don't feel anger. I just feel a profound, aching pity. You see, when you grow up in a system where your basic boundaries are treated as acts of aggression, you learn to negotiate your own comfort just to survive the dinner table. We use a lot of polite, socially acceptable language to describe this dynamic. We call it being the bigger person. We call it taking the high road or keeping the peace. But let me tell you something I learned the hard way. Keeping the peace is often a slow self-destruction with a polite name. When you constantly mute your own voice to keep a toxic family system stable, you aren't actually creating peace at all. You are just internalizing the war. You are taking the violence they want to inflict on you and doing it to yourself, so they don't have to get their hands dirty. I thought the passive-aggressive comments were the absolute extent of it. I thought that as long as I held onto the physical deed, as long as I paid the property taxes every quarter, the cabin was insulated from their greed. I severely underestimated the audacity of a father who believed the universe owed his favorite daughter the sun, the moon, and anything with my name legally attached to it. It happened in late October. Chloe was turning 26, a milestone she somehow decided warranted a 5-week luxury tour of the Greek Isles, accompanied by 3 of her most enabling, equally entitled and yes, I knew for a fact she couldn't afford it. She hadn't held a steady job in 2 years, floating between jobs that paid nothing. I assumed my father was going into massive credit card debt to finance her delusions, as he usually did when she threw a tantrum. I was completely wrong. I only went to his house that afternoon to drop off a misdelivered mail package. He wasn't expecting me. The front door was unlocked, so I stepped inside, intending to leave the box on the console table and slip right back out. That's when I saw the folder on the kitchen island. A thick, manila envelope from a premium real estate brokerage I recognize. What I found inside that folder changed everything I thought I knew about the past 28 years. For almost 3 decades, my default response to their cruelty was to shrink and accommodate. That era of my life ended the moment my eyes adjusted to the bold print on page 1 of that contract. The document was a real estate closing disclosure. Attached to it was a copy of a quitclaim deed. I stared at the signature line. There, in jagged, blue ink, was my name. Below it was a notary stamp, belonging to a man named Arthur Vance, my father's longtime golfing buddy, and a minor partner at his accounting firm. My father hadn't just badgered me to sell the cabin. He had forged my signature to transfer the property directly into a shell trust he controlled, and then immediately listed it for a rapid cash sale to an out-of-state developer who wanted to bulldoze it. The sale price was $300,000. According to the attached wire transfer request, $250,000 of that was slated to cover his mounting business debts, and $50,000 was explicitly earmarked for Chloe's Santorini expedition. He was selling my mother's memory so his favorite daughter could drink champagne on a catamaran. My blood ran cold. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. He actually believed I was so thoroughly beaten down, so terrified of confrontation, that even if I found out, I would just cry, accept a hollow apology, and let him keep the money. He thought I was weak. He didn't realize that grief had burned away my tolerance for his delusions. I didn't cry. I took action. The emotional temperature in my body dropped to absolute 0. The little girl who just wanted her father's approval vanished, replaced entirely by a woman who recognized a crime scene when she saw one. I pulled up my phone and took photographs of every single page, every routing number, every signature, every timestamp. Let me be extremely clear about something. Financial abuse is still abuse, and the most dangerous mistake victims make is confronting the abuser before securing the evidence. When someone crosses a legal boundary, your outrage means absolutely nothing to a judge. The only thing that matters is the paper trail. A paper trail isn't just a collection of receipts. It is a fortress you build around yourself in silence, long before you ever declare war. You document the timeline, you secure the original files, and you do not breathe a word of it until your attorney tells you the trap is completely set. I slid the documents exactly where I found them, down to the millimeter. I walked out to my car, locked the doors, and dialed my attorney Marcus. It wasn't a movie. Marcus didn't answer on the first ring. I sat in the sweltering heat of my car for 20 excruciating minutes, listening to his voicemail greeting, my hands shaking. I forced myself to breathe. Finally, my phone buzzed. "Elena?" Marcus said. "What's wrong?" I explained exactly what I had found. I sent him the encrypted photos. There was a long, heavy pause on his end of the line. "He used Arthur Vance as the notary?" Marcus asked, his tone shifting from professional concern to predatory focus. "Yes, on the 12th of this month." I let out a short, humorless laugh. Here is the hidden power my father knew absolutely nothing about. 6 months prior, on Marcus's advice, I had restructured my assets to protect myself from personal liability. I legally transferred the deed of the cabin from my personal name into a newly formed corporate entity, Lakeside Haven LLC. I was the sole proprietor, but Alina the individual did not own that property. My father had forged my signature on a quitclaim deed for a property I no longer owned. That made it completely void. But because he had transmitted it across state lines, and the buyer initiated the wire transfer to escrow, my father hadn't just committed forgery. He committed multiple counts of federal wire fraud and real estate tampering. And he dragged his golf buddy Arthur into a potential federal indictment with him. They close on Friday, I told Marcus, reading from the notes I took. The buyer's funds are sitting in escrow, scheduled to disburse to his account at noon. Do not say a word to him, Marcus instructed. We don't block the transaction today. We let him think it went through. We let him commit to the wire fraud entirely. Then, we freeze the escrow account on Friday morning, report the fraudulent deed to the title insurance company, and notify the local authorities. The plan was flawless, but what I didn't anticipate was exactly how far my father was willing to push his luck before the trap snapped shut. Over the next 48 hours, I played the most difficult role of my life, the compliant, clueless daughter. On Wednesday evening, my father summoned me to dinner. Chloe was there, practically vibrating with excitement as she scrolled through yacht rentals. Dad is being so amazing, she gushed. He got a massive bonus, so we're upgrading to a private villa in Oya. I looked at my father. He was carving a roast, playing the benevolent patriarch. Well, he smiled. I just want my girls to experience the best. Some of us appreciate those opportunities. He shot me a pointed look. It was a test. He was probing to see if I knew. I kept my voice steady. That sounds wonderful, Chloe. He relaxed completely. He poured another glass of wine, entirely convinced he had seamlessly funded his golden child's fantasy by liquidating my one sanctuary. He had no idea that I had already drafted the emails that would dismantle his life. The countdown to Friday noon was ticking away in my head, and I was ready to watch him burn. But then Thursday night happened, and he made one final, fatal miscalculation that ensured I wouldn't just stop at freezing the funds. What I've told you so far is how they forced me into a corner. What comes next is how I dismantled the room. Thursday night, my father made his fatal miscalculation. He texted me, demanding I come to his accounting firm on Friday at noon to sign routine tax disclosures. He had discovered a complication. The title company had flagged a name mismatch, and the buyer requested a signature to clear the transfer. He needed me to unwittingly ratify the fraudulent sale. He timed it perfectly, assuming I would blindly sign anything hours before the wire transfer. I arrived at his office building at exactly 11:45 a.m. The main elevator was out of service for sudden maintenance. I had to walk up 4 flights of narrow, poorly ventilated stairs in a heavy wool blazer. I stood in the hallway for 5 minutes, practically begging my shaking hands to steady themselves before I opened the glass doors. I thought I was completely ready for that moment. I wasn't. I was terrified. But I pushed through. My father was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, looking at his gold watch with irritated impatience. Chloe was lounging on the leather sofa in the corner, scrolling through designer luggage on her phone. Arthur Vance, the notary, was standing awkwardly near the window, holding a clipboard. "You're late, Alina," my father snapped, tapping a silver pen against the desk. "Just sign the bottom of page 3 so we can wrap this up and I can take your sister to lunch." I didn't reach for the pen. I kept my voice steady, anchoring my feet firmly into the carpet. "I'm not signing anything, Dad." I opened my leather tote bag and pulled out my own folder. I dropped 3 pieces of paper directly over his perfectly arranged tax forms. First, the corporate deed proving Lakeside Haven LLC owned the property. Second, the court-ordered injunction Marcus had filed at 9 p.m. freezing the buyer's escrow account. Third, a copy of the fraudulent quitclaim deed with Arthur's notary stamp clearly visible. My father leaned forward, his irritated smirk still lingering as his eyes scanned the top page. Then the realization hit him like a physical blow. I watched his face completely change as his eyes darted from the LLC deed to the court injunction, reading the words wire fraud and forgery printed in stark black ink. He tried to speak, to muster his usual booming authority, but his jaw just worked silently. Their faces went pale, completely drained of color, as the catastrophic reality of the federal offenses settled over them. He didn't scream. He just sat there, very still, reading it twice. That silence was worse than any outburst. Arthur Vance let out a strange, high-pitched gasp and dropped his clipboard onto the hardwood floor with a sharp clatter. The room went dead silent. "The sale is cancelled," I said. When you finally enforce a boundary against someone who has exploited you for years, their reaction tells you everything you need to know. Boundaries are simply a description of what you will and will not accept. Enforcing them is not cruelty. It is clarity. My father wasn't mourning the loss of his daughter in that moment. He was mourning the loss of my compliance. You cannot reason with someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. People who scream loudest about loyalty have usually done the least to earn it. Chloe, oblivious to the legal gravity of the documents, finally looked up from her phone. "Dad, what is she talking about?" She whined, annoyed that the attention was no longer focused on her. "Are we going to lunch or not? The bank closes at 3 and I need the wire to clear for my villa deposit." My father didn't even look at her. He was staring at Arthur. Arthur was backing away toward the door, his hands raised as if he were trying to physically surrender. "You told me she approved it," Arthur stammered, his voice trembling. "You told me she was on board, Richard. You used my stamp." "Shut up, Art," my father hissed, his voice dropping into a panicked whisper. He finally looked at me. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. "Elena," he started, attempting a placating tone I hadn't heard since childhood. "Sweetheart, let's not overreact. This is a family matter. We can handle this internally." "Marcus is already involved," I replied coldly. "The title company has been notified of the fraud. The buyer's broker is pulling the contract. The authorities have copies of the forged notary stamp. You're destroying this family over a rotting cabin." Chloe suddenly shrieked, finally grasping that her money was gone. She stood up, her face flushed with fury. "Chloe," my father snapped, silencing her instantly. It was the first time I had ever heard him raise his voice at his golden child. He turned back to me. "If you don't call your lawyer right now, I will write you out of my will entirely. You won't get a single cent. You have no estate left," I told him calmly. "But you do have a federal investigation." I packed my bags. Metaphorically speaking, of course. I gathered my purse, adjusted my blazer, and didn't wait for his response. I turned my back on them and walked out of the office, the sound of Arthur's panicked sobbing echoing down the hallway behind me. I walked to the stairwell, my footsteps echoing against the concrete. I didn't feel the urge to turn back and apologize for defending myself. The cold air hit my face as I pushed through the lobby doors. My phone immediately started vibrating. It was my father. I watched his name flash on the screen, blocked the number, and started my car. What I'm about to tell you is the part I almost left out, but you need to hear it. Walking out of that room felt like victory. But the next 72 hours taught me what victory actually costs, because a cornered narcissist, stripped of their narrative control, is the most dangerous version of themselves. You might think that caught dead to rights with forged federal documents, my father would retreat. Instead, he went on the absolute offensive. By 6 o'clock that evening, the smear campaign had begun in earnest. My phone started lighting up with messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. The narrative my father spun was a masterpiece of pathological victimization. He didn't tell them he forged a deed. He didn't mention the federal fraud. He told them his accounting firm had hit a minor cash flow issue, and that I had maliciously frozen his accounts to prevent him from accessing his own money. He told them I was trying to leave him destitute out of petty jealousy. The messages were vicious. They called me ungrateful. They accused me of elder abuse. They told me I was destroying my father's life. One cousin even threatened to expose my cruelty on social media. For a brief, terrifying moment, the decades of childhood conditioning almost worked. I was exhausted. I was sitting on the cold edge of my bathtub, my phone buzzing endlessly against the porcelain tiles. The apartment was completely silent except for the harsh hum of the refrigerator. I actually opened a text message thread to my aunt, my thumbs hovering over the keyboard. I was ready to type an explanation, ready to apologize, ready to offer a financial compromise just to make the relentless anxiety stop. This is what people who have healthy families simply do not understand about trauma bonding. They ask, why didn't you just block them? Why do you even care what they think? But trauma bonding isn't about logic. It is a biological survival mechanism installed in your brain when you were far too young to defend yourself. When the person supposed to protect you is also the person hurting you, your brain learns to associate their approval with your literal survival. Breaking a trauma bond feels like stepping out of an airlock without a spacesuit. You aren't just fighting their manipulation, you are fighting your own nervous system, which is screaming at you that if you do not comply, you will die. Staying loyal to the people who hurt us is the ultimate psychological trap, because they have conditioned you to believe that their abuse is love, and your boundary is a betrayal. I locked my phone screen. I didn't send the text. I didn't explain myself to people who were utterly committed to misunderstanding me. Going no contact is not a dramatic, cinematic event. It is a quiet, grueling medical decision you make to save your own life. Instead of replying, I let Marcus handle the legal fallout, and it was spectacular. On Monday morning, the buyer formally withdrew their offer, citing the frozen escrow and fraudulent title. The title insurance company, furious at the attempted liability, launched a full internal investigation. But the most devastating consequence came from within my father's own trusted circle. Arthur Vance, terrified of losing his notary license and facing federal prison time for wire fraud, completely folded. He hired a defense attorney and handed over every single email, text, and voicemail my father sent him orchestrating the forgery. He proved unequivocally that my father coerced him. In doing so, Arthur blew up my father's reputation. By Wednesday, the senior partners convened an emergency meeting. They voted unanimously to forcibly buy out my father's shares for pennies on the dollar to insulate the firm from the impending criminal investigation. My father was suddenly jobless, facing massive legal fees and staring down a federal inquiry. And yet, the flying monkeys continued to circle. One of his sisters left a weeping, aggressive voicemail, asking how I could possibly live with the shame of what I had done to him. That voicemail forced me to realize the profound difference between guilt and shame. This is something every scapegoat needs to hear. Guilt is the feeling that you did something wrong. It is rooted in your actions, and it is a healthy moral compass. Shame, however, is the feeling that you are wrong. It is a weaponized emotion. Narcissistic family systems do not use guilt, they use shame. They project their toxic behavior onto you until you carry the heavy weight of their sins. My father committed federal fraud, but his sister was actively trying to make me carry the shame of his consequences. When you finally learn to hand their shame back to them when you look at their manufactured crisis and say, "This is yours, not mine," their entire matrix collapses. I felt absolutely no guilt for protecting my mother's cabin, and I absolutely refused to carry his shame. I deleted the voicemail. I blocked her number, and then I blocked the rest of them. Every single person who demanded my compliance over my safety was instantly removed from my life. The quiet that descended on my apartment after that was initially jarring, but for the first time in 28 years, it was peaceful. My father's empire was crumbling, and the money was completely gone. But a narcissistic collapse is almost never contained to just the primary abuser. The fallout inevitably infects the golden child, who suddenly finds themselves without their primary financial sponsor. I honestly thought Chloe would just quietly cancel her lavish trip and fade into the background. I assumed she would play the tragic victim to her friends and look for another source of income. I was completely and utterly wrong, because what happened on that Friday afternoon proved that the golden child dynamic had created a monster even my father couldn't control. What I found waiting on my doorstep that evening was the final piece of the puzzle. Chloe actually showed up at my apartment. It was raining that evening, a miserable, freezing October downpour. When I opened my front door, she was standing on the welcome mat, soaked to the bone, her designer mascara running down her cheeks. "Dad's accounts are completely frozen," she sobbed, not even saying hello. "My villa reservation is going to be cancelled tomorrow morning. He says you did this." You have to fix it, Alina. You have to give me the 50,000. It's my birthday. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it was almost artistic. She wasn't there to apologize for her father trying to steal my mother's memory. She didn't care about the forgery, the wire fraud, or the fact that our family was completely imploding. She only cared that the ATM was broken. For a fraction of a second, an old, deeply buried instinct flared up inside me. The sister who had spent a lifetime fixing her messes felt a brief, agonizing pang of pity. She looked so genuinely pathetic, shivering on my porch. But then I looked closer. I saw the entitlement hardwired into her posture. I saw the utter absence of empathy in her eyes. She wasn't mourning a relationship. She was mourning a transaction. "No, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice steady and incredibly soft. "I don't." I didn't offer an explanation. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her for a long moment, and then I closed the door. I heard her shriek my name, pounding her fists against the wood for about 3 minutes before she finally gave up and walked back out into the rain. That was 3 years ago. I still own the cabin. The roof doesn't leak anymore, and Lakeside Haven LLC is completely insulated from any outside interference. My father avoided federal prison by pleading out, liquidating his remaining assets, and agreeing to permanently surrender his CPA license. The last I heard, he and Chloe were living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment, locked in a miserable, toxic cycle of mutual blame. They destroyed each other, and I didn't have to lift a single finger to help them do it. If there is one thing I want you to take away from this, it is that leaving quietly, legally, and permanently is the most powerful thing you can do. We are taught that victory requires a grand speech, a screaming match where the villain finally admits they were wrong. Let me tell you right now, that moment is never coming. You cannot reason with someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. When you set a boundary, people will call you cruel. They will call you unforgiving. Let them. Your boundaries are not a negotiation. They are a description of what you will and will not accept in your life. Enforcing them isn't an act of aggression, it is an act of clarity. You do not owe anyone your sanity, your peace, or your inheritance just because you happen to share the same bloodline. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to lock the door. And you are allowed to be entirely unbothered by the storms they create for themselves. So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.